Well, we are just overwhelmed with enthusiasm in terms of how many people are here. We have a couple of more piles of chairs that'll be coming down, so please let Bill make his way through to the back to set those up. And after that, it's standing room only. But we thank you for being here for this edition of Bites and Bits of History, brought to you by the John and Loretta Hines Foundation. My name is Bill Lawson. I'm Executive Director of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. We own and operate this facility, the Tyler History Center, as well as the Arms Family Museum at 648 Wick Avenue. So we're very pleased, our members, our board of directors, our staff, to have you all here today. Any latecomers that missed my message from about 10, 12 minutes ago, if you are parked on this side of the building, which is the side, if you came in, you saw the Ohio Historical Marker. It's the side between the building and the Home Savings Building. You cannot stay there. That is a private monthly parking lot, and they will ticket you and possibly tow you. There was parking in the back, hopefully. I think we're pretty full on this side, and then any spots available on the street, which is 2 hours free. So keep that in mind, and I said be patient while we try to get the rest of our chairs up here. Before I introduce our speaker and the topic for today, I wanted to point out a program that's coming up very soon that we're very excited about. It'll be here at the Tyler History Center, and there are flyers on the tables about it. We are working with the Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies at Youngstown State University, the American Slovak Cultural Association, and our Historical Society on bringing a traveling exhibit here called the Tragedy of the Slovak Jews. And this is produced by the Czech and Slovak Museum and Cultural Center, which is in Iowa, and it's been around the country, and it's coming here to the Mahoning Valley and the Tyler History Center. We are having an opening reception on Tuesday, April 30th, and it says right there, the doors will open at 5. We'll let people go through and see the exhibit, and then at 6 o'clock, we have a speaker who will be here from Purdue University to talk about this issue. So please consider coming, and then it will be on exhibit here until May 31st. So the evening of April 30th throughout the rest of May, and then it'll be moving on. And we have another program that is scheduled for Tuesday, May 7th, and that'll be 7 in the evening here in this room. It's an exhibit that was produced in Czechoslovakia in the 1960s about the treatment of Jews in Slovakia during World War II. It's called The Shop on Main Street, and it's very well done. It's subtitled, and just a wonderful piece of cinematography that also gives you a very prescient look at the conditions that led to the Holocaust and how that affected Slovakia. So please consider joining us for that. It's open to the public once again, and will be screened right in this room on Tuesday, May 7th. So, that being said for now, our next program will be the 23rd? May 19th, thank you. Okay. 16th?
Yeah,
May 16th, okay. All right, we'll pick up on that later. But we want to get started here. Our speaker today is Traci Manning, who's the Curator of Education for the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. She's been with us now for 7 years, and she holds a Bachelor of Arts in Religion and Civil War Era Studies from Gettysburg College, and a Master of Arts in Applied History from Shippensburg University. Those are both in Pennsylvania. Traci is a native of Pennsylvania, and She has, prior to working for the Historical Society, had years of experience in the National Park Service working for two different Civil War era sites in West Virginia and Mississippi. And since June 2012, she has served as our Curator of Education. But we will, oh, I forgot one more thing, I better do it now. Sorry about this. Saturday, May 4th, we have a workshop program titled Exploring Your Roots, an Introduction to Genealogy, which will be here at this location at Tyler History. There's a fee attached, but there's more information on the tables with flyers. And I just interrupted our whole introduction program, but I had to do it so I didn't forget. And while I'm at it, interrupting the introduction, yes, Thursday, May 16th, again, I think it's going to be very popular to attend that. It'll be an afternoon with Rich Morgan, who recently retired from WKBN. He worked for 4 decades, both in radio and television, and he's going to talk about his experience in the local broadcasting industry. So that's noon on Thursday, May 16th. Okay, now, back to what we're talking about today. I introduced Traci for you. The topic, of course, is Youngstown and the Titanic, and I'm pleased to welcome Traci Manning.
No one's quite as tall as Bill, so I'm gonna pull this down here. So thank you all. I needless to say, I'm overwhelmed by the interest in this presentation today, and the amount of folks that came out. I'm happy to see a lot of new faces. This is a program we do every month, on the 3rd Thursday of every month, so make sure you tack that on your fridge and come back. We've got some great programs coming up. But if we could get the lights, we're going to start. We got a lot to get through, and I want to make sure we can get to the end of the story. So we'll talk a little bit here about kind of the origins of the ship herself, where she was built, and so on. So kind of the main question I want to start with is, why are we so fascinated with the story of the Titanic? I think there's a lot of reasons. I think that the movie certainly helped in 1997. I think that just locally, most folks know about the Wick family and their stories and struggles on the ship. But we're not only going to talk about the Wicks today, we're going to talk about several other local families that were impacted and involved with this. We're going to talk about what led to this tragedy, what happened that night, and then some stories that I find really compelling, that maybe are stories you had never heard of before. I'm going to try to paint as complete a story as I can, but in doing so, we are going to kind of shrink down some of the larger stories into this. So we'll talk a little bit about how this ship was kind of came into life. Most people called it unsinkable. Spoiler alert. It did sink, so I'm not taking away the ending, we all know that. So let's talk a little bit about the construction. The ship was set to be one of the White Star Line's signature vessels, one of the largest in size, as well as filled with the pinnacle of luxury. The ship was built in the yards of Harland and Wolff in Belfast in Ireland. And from the concept to the launch, the ship was among, with her sister, the Olympic, who are of great interest to the public. Now, a lot of these construction pictures we're looking at are of the Titanic, but when we go into the interior, a lot of the interior shots are of the Olympic, which was kind of her twin sister. And we'll talk a little bit about why I think we don't have interior images of the Titanic. But early on, some decisions are going to be made. So decisions are mapped out by builders, designers, and engineers, but ultimately all of the decisions are decided by J. Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman of the White Star Line. Essentially, he owned the ship, he owned the company. And we're going to revisit him later. And in this image, you can see the layout of the decks where the lifeboats were scheduled to be, where they're designed to be. Now, at this time, there was expected to be a change by the British Board of Trade in their lifeboat regulations, but it did not materialize. So legally, ships were actually only required to have lifeboat space for less than 1/3 of the capacity of the ship itself. So they had initially designed for 32 lifeboats, which still would not have been enough. But because that regulation change didn't happen, They scrapped the 32 and went to 16. So the Titanic was equipped with only 16 lifeboats, and then an additional 4 collapsible boats were added, which many considered to be excessive and ugly, because this wasn't an issue, right? The ship was not going to sink. So I have a few more images here of kind of her setting sail and coming out of her launch. So the image on the left was taken on April 5th, 1912, which was Good Friday. She had multicolored flags seen here from her lines, and it was actually the only day the ship was dressed with all of those flags. And you can see some of the other ships as she was in port before hitting the open seas. The next few images, these are all from a book that we have down in our archives that was pulled together by the Titanic Historical Society. So I do want to take this minute to give a shout out to our archive staff, Pam and Chelsea, who worked tirelessly to help me pull all of this information together. And you're more than welcome to visit them to see the breadth of this research. Maybe not all at once, there's a lot of people here. But come back and visit and see the full collection that we have downstairs. So these images, these are in the early days of the maiden voyage, while the ship was still moving around the ports in Ireland, England, and in France. So just to give you an idea what she looked like. A few more shots there. We're going to do a quick tour of the ship because even third-class passengers talked about just how luxurious she really was. So this was the pinnacle of luxury. This was the finest thing to ever hit the open seas. So most of these pictures, like I said, are from the Olympic. For everything we know, they had pretty much identical interiors. And there's a lot of speculation as to why we don't have interior images of the Titanic. My thought is they went down with the ship. This was her maiden voyage, and there's a good chance that there were photographers on board, and those images and the film was lost. But there's also a question of why aren't there pictures from when she was being outfitted? And we really don't have those. We have the images from the Olympic. And perhaps they just thought they look exactly the same. Why take both? So we're not entirely sure, but most of these interior images are from the Olympic. So you can see here in third class, it's very much a cafeteria-style dining area. This is kind of a lounge area. More third-class stops here. You can see just a bit of what the ship would have looked like. This was the entrance into the third-class area of the ship. So just very simple, not a lot of fine elements to the third-class part of the ship. Come on in, folks. There's plenty of room in the back. Yeah, just head right to the back there. There should be some places to stand, hopefully some chairs back there as well. All right, we're going to move into the second class areas of the ship. You can see we start to get a little fancier, and we're spending a little bit more money here in second class. This would have been their staircase area of the ship. This was their dining and lounge area in second class. We have a few more images of dining, and then I have a couple of images of what their berths would look like. There's some speculation as to what third class berths look like, what their cabins look like. But for the most part, second and third class were pretty similar aboard the ship as far as their cabins went. So you can see it's kind of a bunk bed style. There would have been a small lavatory and then some storage. And then here's two more images of second class cabins aboard the ship. So we'll head to first class, a little bit different up there. First class looks a bit like this. So we have many dining options in first class. We have libraries of all sorts of things up there. This would have been one of the first class areas to board the ship. This would have been one of the lounges. We have another smoking lounge here. We have another dining or angle of the dining room there. Another dining area here, some private dining areas aboard the ship. Here we have the barber shop, as well as the gym. It actually had a pretty state-of-the-art gym aboard. On the next image, you see the Turkish baths here, another private dining balcony. We'll get into some of the staterooms and what first class looked like. So you can see this was actually a private balcony for the nicest cabin aboard the ship. It was massive. A few more interior stateroom shots. So significantly different from what we saw in second and third class. And also it's interesting to note most of the cabins were different. They were all kind of designed a little bit differently. Nothing looked exactly the same. And then, of course, there's the grand staircase, which is beautiful. And we all know, everyone knows, that this is where Jack and Rose finally get their happy ending. So, I had to do it, and I had to put something in there about the movie. So, I will say the makers of the Titanic got a lot of stuff wrong, but they did work very hard to get the look of the ship to look pretty accurate. So, and they did. I mean, you can see it looks quite like that image there. So let's get a little bit more local. Let's talk about the families locally. Let's talk about who was around here. So for most people in the Mahoning Valley, George Dennick Wick and his family were the most prominent people on board. Now, George was the son of Paul and Susan Wick and became a titan of local industry. We could spend a bit of time talking about his life, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to mention a few highlights. I'd say that he's most remembered for his time serving as the president and treasurer of Youngstown Sheet and Tube, as well as the first vice president of the General Fireproofing Company. He was educated locally in various public schools, and then he went to Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. His first business ventures were in Chicago with the Wick, Bunnell and Company rolling mills, and he worked with John Meek Bunnell, who was an in-law, and the father of Caroline Bunnell, who we're going to meet shortly. He later moved to Cleveland, where he became engaged with the sale of iron commodities. Now, he was married to a prominent Cleveland socialite, Mary Caroline Chamberlain, in 1879. But she passes away around 1893. So prior to that, he returns to Youngstown and becomes associated with, among other companies, the Trumbull Iron Company, of which he became the president. And by 1897, he was president of the Mahoning Valley Iron Company. And following a stretch of ill health, he retired temporarily in 1902, but later returned to work in the iron business. And he acquired the title of colonel. We hear him referred to a lot as Colonel Wick, when he was appointed as an aide-de-camp to Governor Asa Bushnell. Now, after his first wife had passed away, they did have one child, Mary Natalie, but he did remarry to Mary Peebles Hitchcock, also from Youngstown, and they will have one child, George Dennick Wick Jr., in 1897. So there's a little bit of his bio. So let's talk kind of what takes them onto this trip. Here's Mary Natalie Wick and Carolyn Bunnell. So his health was kind of declining in this early winter of 1912, really, and it was in February that his family pushed him to take a much-needed vacation. And so in February, it was actually on February 14th, George and his wife Mary, who most knew as Molly, left for Europe with their daughter Mary Natalie and Natalie's cousin Caroline, who I mentioned was also the daughter of John Meek Bunnell, one of his business associates. So George secured them tickets in a first-class cabin, there were several first-class cabins, aboard the Titanic for its maiden voyage, as the return trip back to the United States. Now, returning with them would be Caroline's aunt Elizabeth, or Lily, who was from England. Now, while in Europe, George's health improved, both physically and mentally, and he received word while in Paris that his brother-in-law, Porter Pollock, and William McKelvey of McKelvey's, also local business leaders, were in Europe on a business trip, and they would be returning with them on the Titanic as their return trip back to the States. But as fate would have it, though, that did not end up happening, as both Pollock and McKelvey needed to stay in Europe a little bit longer. So the Wick party boards the Titanic in Southampton in April 10, and we have some idea of where their cabins were, and this is where the research starts to get really fun. So according to a few accounts, we know that Elizabeth Bunnell, it's Lily, was in cabin C-103, berth 1. Now, there were 3 berths in this room, so we're not entirely sure if anyone else was with her. She was a woman of 61 years old, so it's possible that she just simply wanted her own cabin, and it just happened to have 2 extra beds in it. So C-103 is this one right here. This is on the C deck, which is this deck right here with the portholes. So Caroline Bunnell was assigned to cabin C7, and it's likely that Mary Natalie Wick stayed there with her. And C7, is right here in the corner. So that's where Caroline's room was. Now, a few other rooms of note, because I just think it's interesting. This is John Jacob Astor and his new wife Madeline's suite, right there. Massive, huge room, huge set of suites. And then this was Isidore and Ida Strauss, who we'll talk about a little bit later, kind of almost right across the hall from where Lily was staying. And then this would be one of those grand staircases that we saw earlier. There were several of them aboard the ship that all looked kind of the same. So the location of the cabins on the Titanic is kind of really interesting to me. I think it's really fascinating where people were staying and who they were staying near. But the thing is, we don't have a list. There is no definitive list of who was in what cabin. There's actually no definitive passenger list at all of any passengers aboard this ship. There are several compiled lists that different organizations have pulled together, but not one organization can say we have the definitive ship's manifest of the RMS Titanic, because it just simply doesn't exist. It either went down with the ship or it was, most likely went down with the ship. But we do have some accounts, and then we have something that was uncovered on the body of a first-class steward named Herbert Cave. And this famously is known as the Cave List. So what Herbert Cave had was this. And this was his first-class passenger list that was given to him, I believe, on April 10th, just as the ship is starting to set sail. Now, it's interesting to note that there are many first-class passengers not on his list. John Jacob Astor and Madeline, not on the list. The Wicks are not on this list. All of them purchased their tickets well in advance to be able to be on Cave's list, but they're not. You can see the Bonnells are, so we can see that Caroline was in C7 and Lily is in C103, berth 1. There's some speculation as to why first-class passengers would not want to be on this list. Some people say it was for privacy, that if somebody grabbed this list from Herbert Cave, they're going to know where everybody's at. So some people say that there were first-class passengers who said, you know what, don't put us on the list, you know where we're at, we don't want people to know what cabin we're in. So that's likely why certain people are not on Cave's list. Well, because of this, we don't know where the Wicks were. We don't know if they were in C7 with Caroline, and we can assume Mary Natalie, or if they also had their own cabin aboard this ship. So a couple other things back here. This porthole, this first one right here, that is C7. That is where Caroline was, Caroline and Mary Natalie. So kind of fun looking at the floor plans and seeing where everyone was at. So let's keep going. We're going to talk about some other folks who were aboard this ship. And we're going to talk about a woman whose story has really moved me. I have come across about a dozen names for this woman, a dozen different spellings, and I assure you I will do my best in pronouncing them as well as I can. So this is Shamina Abi Saab, who also went with the last name George, with the last name Wabe, but mostly here in the States, she was known as her English version, which was Jenny George. So we're going to talk a little bit about her life. So she was born in 1874 in Lebanon. And when her family emigrated to America, they dropped the last name of Wabe and used George as their last name. And she, like I said, would go with the name Jenny. Now, it was a Lebanese custom to have some kind of dowry, but she was the youngest daughter and she didn't have a dowry. So her goal was to move here to the United States and earn money. This is still at a time when people think the streets are paved with gold here in America. So she assumed she could come here, she could move here, earn some money, go back to Lebanon, and then buy land and buy a house, which would kind of take the place of the dowry she did not have. But that did not come to be. Her husband, Joseph, passed away in 1908, and she stays in America and eventually will bring all of her children to come to live here with her in Youngstown. Now, around 1910, her son Thomas, who was 17 years old, became very ill. And Jenny was told by his doctor that he should return back to Lebanon, thinking that the fresh air would be better suited to him recovering. So she sent him, along with her son Joseph, back to Lebanon. Now, sometime in late 1910 or early 1912, she received news from her sister that Thomas was rapidly deteriorating. So she left her daughters, Rosie and Mary, in the care of the Christ Mission Society and boarded a ship back to Lebanon. And by the time she arrived in Lebanon, her son Thomas had passed away just 10 days before she got back in town. And she spent the next year gathering her family affairs in order before making plans to return to America in the spring of 1912. So she traveled by ship to Cherbourg in France, where she boarded the Titanic, and we know that she paid £4 and 4 shillings for her third-class ticket, which we also know was number 2688. And she boarded the Titanic with 3 of her cousins. Again, I'm going to try to, with these names, I do have their original spelling. So I believe it's Tanis Thomas, George Joseph, which was the English version, and then Tanis Dohar. All of these cousins were planning to move here to this area to get jobs in local industrial factories, steel mills, and so on. She was also aboard the ship with Benura Ayoub, which was a 13-year-old niece of one of her cousins who was coming to America to be reunited with her family in Detroit. And we're going to come back to Jenny's story a few times as we go through what happens the night of April 14th. So we could spend months talking about everything that happens that night, but I do want to hit some things that I think are kind of interesting. So during the evening of April 14th, the Titanic's radio crew received several warnings about drifting ice in the area. Now, we'll never know why all of those messages were not given to the ship's crew, but they weren't. The ship's crew, the radio operators, were getting wireless signals in, telling them to slow down, first of all. They were going almost at full speed, and warning them of the ice. But there's a reason that these messages were not relayed. So it's worth noting that most wireless operators aboard most ships at this time were actually not members of the crew. Instead, they were employed by the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company, and their main responsibility is not ship safety. They are not members of the White Star Line crew. Their main responsibility is actually to send messages for the passengers. It's a wireless company. That's what Marconi wanted. He wanted to make money, and you don't make money answering a safety call. You make money when Mrs. Wick wants to send a message back to Youngstown. That's when you make money. So those weather reports and safety messages would have been a secondary responsibility, especially with more than 2,000 passengers aboard trying to send messages home. So needless to say, the warnings came in quickly that night, and the ship's crew, especially the lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, noted how calm and clear the night was. This really impacts what's going to happen because the water was not moving. The stars were impressive, but there was no moon. And the water was so calm and the atmospheric conditions were just right that seeing icebergs within a safe distance was almost impossible. If you think about, I saw a documentary actually just the other night talking about how light moves when you have different air temperatures. So think about when you've stood above a city and you've seen lights that are miles and miles away, and it looks like those lights are flickering. Well, it's because the way that light wave is traveling through the air and the temperatures of the air is making that light move. So it makes it very difficult to see what is happening, and that's going to really impact us as we go ahead. So I want to talk a little bit about the wireless areas here of the ship. Again, these are operated by the Marconi Wireless Company. And I talked a little bit about why they're not as concerned with safety messages as you would expect them to be. It's a private company working for Marconi. It's also interesting to note not every ship is outfitted with wireless at this time. So even if there were other ships in the area, they might not hear them. Also, some ships only had one wireless operator, one Marconi operator, and he's got to sleep sometime. So even if they have a wireless operator, he might not be at his desk listening to the signals. That's going to come into play big time. So about 11:39 p.m., Fleet, who was in the lookout, rang the lookout bell and called to the bridge to inform James Moody of what he saw. And the conversation went something like, "Is there anyone there?" Moody responded, "Yes, what do you see?" And now famously, perhaps infamously, he responds with, "Iceberg right ahead." So the ship's officers worked to change their course, but with a ship of that size, executing a full swing around the iceberg would take a lot of time. This was time that they didn't have. Putting the engines in reverse and turning the rudder was not only challenging, but time-consuming. So at approximately 11:40, the ship struck the iceberg on the starboard side, scraping along the side of the ship for several seconds. Some say it actually lasted about 7 seconds, which you think is don't think is a long time until you kind of count it out in your head. 7 seconds is a long time to be scraping along the side of that iceberg. Now, within a few minutes, the engines were stopped. So this moment has been the subject of intense debate for more than 107 years now, this from the moment it happened, and will continue to be as we move forward. So we have these eyewitnesses accounts, we have inquiry, we have testimony, we have folks remembering what they saw, and then now we have technology that's actually taken cameras to the ship herself at the bottom of the Atlantic to see what really happened. But I think it's kind of interesting that we may never know everything that led to how much water was coming onto the ship because she began to flood immediately to the point that even the watertight doors were not enough. So Captain Smith, along with several other officers, were already in their cabins for the evening, but most of them felt the collision and rushed back to the bridge. Smith sent for Thomas Andrews, who was the ship's builder, for assistance. And what they found was that the ship was simply taking on too much water, and the weight and the amount of the water was too much to handle or to try to pump out. We could spend, again, hours talking about this, but we know what happens. We know that within 3 hours after the collision, she's gone. She's completely under the water. So what happens in those 3 hours? A lot of things happen in these 3 hours. Now, there are more than 2,200 people aboard the ship, and the race to save their lives was on. Now, 25 minutes after the initial collision, Captain Smith orders the lifeboats to be uncovered and the passengers to be mustered. It was around this time that the wireless crew began their distress calls, and we're going to talk a lot about that later. The passenger muster was a mess, to be completely honest with you. The stewards assisting with this work had, in most cases, never done it before. If you've been on cruises today, you know it's something you practice. They didn't practice this then. So most of the crew had actually never done it before, and of course most of the passengers had probably never done it before either. So in first class, there were several stewards to assist the passengers, but in second and third class, there just simply weren't enough. So while the first class passengers had time to secure their items, to kind of change and get into evening clothing and so on, in the lower classes, orders were simply shouted. Jenny is going to tell a story of people just opening up doors saying, get your lifeboats on and go, get to the decks, because there's just too many people down there. Now, some passengers are reluctant to board their assigned lifeboats, especially in the first class, but the chaos was starting to begin. The noise of the high-pressure steam coming off the boilers was so loud that the orders could not be heard, and the crew had to use hand signals to try to communicate. And we know the ship only had 20 lifeboats. 16 of those boats were wooden, and 4 were collapsible, which were made of canvas sides and a wooden bottom. And if you recall the decisions of the ship's designers to place only 20 boats instead of what they could have held, you'll know that a disaster like this is basically going to mean hundreds, if not thousands, of souls on board will perish, even under the best conditions. And these conditions are anything but ideal. And we've all heard stories about there not being enough boats or the boats not being full. And yes, those things are true, but I want you to think about what's happening that night. The confusion, the uncertainty, the lack of experience, how quickly everything happened, the time that it took to not only fill the boats, but then lower them evenly down the side of the ship to the level of the water surface took a lot of time. We're never going to know fully why they weren't filled to capacity, but they weren't. Now, in looking back at this event, these 3 hours, I kind of find it's either one or the other. Survivors either want to remember their story and they want to tell it, sometimes maybe only once and never tell it again, or they never want to speak of it. It was very interesting that you couldn't find a lot of gray area of folks that either did or did not want to tell what happened. And I have no idea what we could have done in this situation, what I would have done, what any of us would have done in this situation. So let's take a look at some of those decisions that folks made. So we're going to talk a little bit about Lifeboat 8. Now, this is not an image of Lifeboat 8. This is Lifeboat number 6, but it looks exactly the same, so that's why I put it there. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this account later on. But on April 19th, the Youngstown Vindicator published an article called Miss Bunnell's Graphic Story of the Rescue of Survivors. This account detailed what happened with the Wick party that evening. Now remember, we're going to come back to this account. So just listen to what I'm saying, we'll get back to it. So according to this account, Carolyn dressed and hurried to the deck with her Aunt Elizabeth. She recalls that no one believed the ship would actually sink. The article quotes by saying, our party went to the second boat launched on the port side, and officers of the ship were insisting that the women get in first. There was no confusion, no trouble. Everything was more in the spirit of a picnic than anything else. So that's what Caroline remembers right away. Now, Molly would recall later, in a later account told to her sister, it was also published in the Vindicator, that the girls hurried into their clothes to rush to the deck to see an iceberg, and while Molly dressed throughout. The girls returned, however, with George. They had been told to secure their valuables and fasten on their life preservers. As they made their way toward the lifeboats, there was no panic. And back to Caroline's account, they write, while we were waiting to be put into the boat, I heard that on the other side, the side that had actually struck, both men and women were entering the boats, and many women refused to get into their boats to leave their husband. The article then goes on to recall her seeing John Jacob Astor kiss his new wife. She recalls watching the ship go under as their boat rode away. The article quotes, then the full horror of the thing came over us. We were frightened. But the men in the boat tried to reassure us. They told us that those left behind on the boat would surely leave it, and that they would be picked up at a short time. So we'll get back to that account in a little while, but keep those words in your mind. So Molly's account continues, George helped them into their places with the aid of another man having a stateroom opposite of theirs. And when they said goodbye to George, he suggested that he would join Clarence Moore, an acquaintance of his on the ship, and come off the boat with him. The article then states, the pitifulness of it seemed positively heartbreaking. No fond farewells, no tender messages, no last lingering looks of love when they parted, never again to see each other in this life. But perhaps the very commonplace of that goodbye inspired the nerve and fortitude to bear the ordeal of those trying hours to follow. Now, the boat that Caroline, her Aunt Lily, Molly, and Mary Natalie was on was Lifeboat number 8. This was very likely the first boat actually launched on the port side. The officers were very strict that this was only women to be on their boat. They were not allowing first-class men onto the boat. I do have an account of what it was like on that particular lifeboat from a Mrs. Margaret Smith who joined them. She writes that there were 22 persons aboard, including a seaman and a steward. As we were suspended over the water far below, Captain Smith tucked a loaf of bread into the bow, where there were also 2 casks of water. Slowly we dropped down and down until the keel of our tiny craft struck the sea, and the captain shouted to pull over to a red light in the distance. We began to realize that the seamen were not oarsmen, and that one was unable to pull the long, heavy oar with any strength. So we took his place. The weak and unskilled steward and some of the other men sat quietly at one end of the boat, and the Countess of Roths was an expert oarswoman. So most of the women are taking over to row them to the lights they can see in the distance. Now, there's also a heartbreaking scene that happens surrounding Lifeboat number 8. And in this image, you can see Ida Strauss and her husband Isidore, and they were New York merchants, of course famous for the Macy store conglomerate, that company. So she was preparing to board the boat, but refused, saying, I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so we will die together. And they offered the 67-year-old Isidore to get onto a lifeboat, but he refused, saying, I do not wish any distinction in my favor, which is not granted to others. And they were last seen walking together arm in arm on the deck. So the Wick party recalled seeing George standing on the deck, simply waving goodbye as the lifeboat was lowered. And that was the last that they would ever see of him. So we're going to talk a little bit about another lifeboat that's coming off the ship. We'll get back. I'm trying to do this in like chronological order as we go forward here. So what's happening down in third class, especially with Jenny? So she spoke of her experiences several years later to the Sharon Herald. And she writes, men, women, and children were storming into the hallways. I remembered my 3 cousins who were on the boat too, and I ran to their room, but they were gone. In the hallway was the 14-year-old girl, Benora, the relative of one of my cousins. I grabbed her and pulled her with me. We were ordered to put on life preservers, and the sailors and men passengers pushed and pulled us up to the deck. Lifeboats were being lowered when we arrived there, and I saw George Joseph, one of my cousins. He pushed me towards one of the lifeboats, and sailors armed with revolvers drove the men away from the boats, shouting, women and children first. They shot into the air to frighten the men. Benora and I were placed in the next to last lifeboat to be lowered from the ship, and when it was being lowered, frightened women, fearing it would capsize, jumped from it. Now, her grandson recalls a very similar story that she would tell, but he kind of goes into it a little bit deeper. She says that she was sleeping. She was awoken by the shouting. She talks a little bit, or he talks a little bit, kind of what she realized, what was truly happening. Writing, when she looked back, she realized that those men simply were not going to get off the ship. She was grateful for their sacrifice, that these wealthy men would try to save her, a third-class passenger dressed only in her nightgown. That always stayed with her, and Joseph remembered that his grandmother always cried when she spoke of those men. As they were going away, they saw the Titanic sinking. They all sat there listening to the screaming until the screaming stopped. And throughout the night, they awaited rescue. Jenny listened to the cries of another immigrant woman who had been separated from her 5-year-old son, who was also named Thomas. The woman believed the boy perished on the ship, and the woman's grief flooded Jenny with the memories of the loss of her own son in Lebanon. And after being rescued by the Carpathia, she discovered a nurse aboard the ship with a young child and recognized him as the missing Thomas and reunited the mother with the child, stating that that reunion was a sight I will never forget. Now, also aboard this collapsible lifeboat number C, was Bruce Ismay. Now, if you remember, he's the chairman of the White Star Line and the highest ranking official to survive the sinking. He took a lot of criticism with the fact that he did not go down with the ship. A lot of people also blame him for being the reason the ship sank, as he was the one ordering the ship's engines to be pushed as fast and as hard as they will go. But Jenny George is on the same collapsible boat with Bruce Ismay. So this is where I want to tell a story that I find very compelling, and it is the story of her calls for help. So we have this chart here of where the closest ships were to Titanic when this whole thing was happening. So Titanic's right here, right in this ice. And you'll notice the Californian is like right there. Californian's pretty close. So let's explore why the Californian did not come to Titanic's rescue. So it's the closest ship, but so many things stopped her from coming to the assistance, and I'm going to try to summarize what happened. So in the wireless room aboard the Californian, their Marconi operator, Evans, needed to wind their signal detector. I could try to explain what all of that is, but just trust me, it's a little metal thing that needs to go round and round and round to hear the wireless signals, and he didn't wind it up. So that's what's happening. So, meanwhile, aboard the deck near the bridge, the Californian's captain, Stanley Lords, recognizes a ship nearby. But to him it appeared to be only a steamer or perhaps a cargo ship. He asked his chief engineer if there were any other ships in the vicinity, but the engineer responded, only the Titanic, to which Lord responded, that's not the Titanic. She's a vessel close to us in size. So even still, he had his ship attempt to contact her. Now remember, the Morse the wireless signal is not working. So they used the Morse lamp to try to contact the ship in the distance. So just figure a light with the things that open and close the light to send out Morse code. But there's no answer from the ship in the distance. And as the night went on, a few interesting things are going to happen. Ernest Gill, who was a fireman on the Californian, he was on the deck. And it was just after midnight, and he saw what he called a very large steamer less than 10 miles away. I watched her for a full minute going full speed. So he goes to bed, but he's unable to sleep, and about 30 minutes later, he goes back to the deck, where he sees a white rocket be launched about 10 miles away on the starboard side. A few minutes later, he saw another rocket in the same place. But this is a quote from his testimony. He says, "It was not my business to notify the bridge or the lookouts, and I immediately turned in." So he goes to bed, having seen these rockets get launched. So the bridge continues to contact the ship in the distance, but to no avail. And eventually an officer is going to see a light that appears to be a porthole or an open door, but notes that the ship appeared to be a small tramp steamer about 5 miles off. Still, they try to contact her, no answer at all. Looking through the binoculars, they notice lights flashing that they thought could have been the response to their Morse lamp. But they couldn't make out a pattern and assumed it was only a masthead oil lamp. So Captain Lord is in the chart room, and he's asked to be notified if they hear from the other ship. As the night goes on, the ship never answers, and eventually it appears that she turns and parts from their view. Several officers notice more rockets being launched into the air, but the captain asked what color they were, noting that white rockets tended to be private, whereas colored rockets had some kind of message involved. So Lord said, it's fine, they turned, they can't see it anymore, it's no big deal. And if you're wondering what's happening with the wireless, he's not trying to fix it. Evans went to bed. So no one can hear any of the wireless calls coming from Titanic. So if you put their testimony together of what they saw that night, yes, they witnessed the Titanic sinking about 5 miles away. But the atmospheric conditions made the ship look a lot smaller. If you remember those light waves, it's going to distort the Morse lamp coming. And because Evans goes to bed, no one is there to listen to the broken wireless signal that he could have fixed simply by spending about 30 seconds to wind it back up before going to bed. So meanwhile, aboard the Titanic, the wireless crew is working tirelessly up until water actually reaches their feet, sending signals out. And those two wireless operators were Jack Phillip and Harold Bride. And these are those are pictures of them. Jack Phillips is this one, and this is Harold Bride. So they're the Marconi operators on the Titanic. So these are some of the copies of the messages that were sent to and from Titanic that night. Now, a lot of people like to talk about SOS, and the Titanic disaster being the first time it's ever used in a maritime disaster, and it is true. But a lot of people think SOS means something, and it doesn't. SOS does not mean save our souls or save our ships or anything like that. SOS is what's called a pro sign, and a pro sign is something in amateur radio that is very repetitive and easy to hear over the airwaves. Prior to this, the distress signal was actually CQD. So if you look at all these messages, they're sending both SOS and CQD. The CQ just meaning, hey, is anybody out there? And the D meaning distress. So the initial distress calls were CQD. And then around this time, they've started changing to something more standard known as SOS, which was just a pro sign. It's just really repetitive. Think about what SOS sounds like, and if you hear it 10 times, your ear is going to perk up. You're going to notice a really repetitive signal. So the main messages coming from Titanic that night are CQD, SOS from MGY, and MGY was the Titanic's call sign. There are dozens of messages that are sent. I pulled a couple. You can see this one here. This is the initial one. She says, we have struck an iceberg, sinking fast, come to our assistance. In the top right, she says, we're sinking fast, passengers being put into boats. And the bottom left is her last message the Titanic sent, women and children in boats cannot last much longer. Now, other ships are trying to respond back to her. This actually came from the Burma, which is another nearby ship, saying we're only 100 miles from you, we're on our way. And there were many messages like that saying we're on our way, but no one's close enough to get there to actually help until the next morning. Reading some of those wireless messages just hit me in the gut, just the kind of desperation of these people trying to help and then trying to say what's going on. So meanwhile on the Carpathia, this is Harold Cottam. And his role is another kind of happenstance thing that happens. Harold Cottam is the only wireless operator on the Carpathia, and he was pretty important in what happened that evening because he is ready to go to bed. He's the only operator. He's going to go to bed. The wireless is going to get shut off. But for whatever reason, he goes back into his room and he puts his headphones on. And that's when he hears Harold Bride and Jack Phillips calling out from the Titanic what's happening. So he immediately tells his bridge crew, they turn the Carpathia speeding towards the Titanic. And during that 4-hour trip that the Carpathia took to reach the scene, he is tirelessly sending messages of their progress and then also relaying messages back and forth as the Titanic loses power. Because as she's losing power, her signal gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and she can't talk to the ships as far away anymore. Now, he is going to be vital as well when the Carpathia starts picking up survivors. Jack Phillips will not survive. Harold Bride's story of survival is remarkable. I'm not going to take the time to tell it, but you're more than welcome to ask me after what his story of survival was like. But Harold Bride will also come aboard the Carpathia to help his friend, Harold Cottam, these two knew each other, in sending messages from the Carpathia with survivors to the shore here in the States. So this is all happening on the night of April 14th into the morning of April 15th. What's the news look like? So here in Youngstown, the Vindicator had this front page cover on April 15th, and the news spreads like wildfire throughout most of the Western world. Most newspapers featured front page stories in the first few days, but here in Youngstown, the local interest keeps this story in our newspapers for weeks, mostly on the front page, and then eventually it's all over the newspaper, but it's on the front page for weeks to come. Now, initially, not much is known. You can see that the first cover actually only reported the incident as an accident and a wreck, noting that 4 residents of the city were among the passengers aboard, referring, of course, to the Wick party. Now, these first papers are riddled with inaccuracies, speculation, all the things you'd expect, and a lot of miscommunication. All of this is to be expected with an event of this magnitude. So later that same day, the Vindicator will publish an extra newspaper. This was the second issue on the same day. And this is when they received word that the ship had actually gone down. And the reporting of only about 675 survivors was relatively accurate. And it also changed the initial report of where the survivors were. So their main story reads, "The rumor of the Titanic, which collided with an iceberg off Newfoundland, was sinking, was not only confirmed in an Associated Press dispatch received Monday night about 8:30 o'clock, but the appalling news came that the monster boat had gone down and carried hundreds of her passengers to death." So they had a caption here with a picture of Mr. Wick, and it reads, "Youngstown man whose life may have been lost in the Titanic disaster." The story goes on to report that local relatives had not yet received word from the Youngstown people who were aboard the Titanic Monday night, and that there were grave fears for their safety. So the following day, on April 16th, this was the front page of the Vindicator, and this reports that members of the Wick party had all been reported safe. And you can see that, noting that they're on the Carpathia. So I want to share with you a few news stories that are going to hit the papers here locally as we move forward. So on the front page of this April 16th issue, they write, "Youngstown passengers safe. Direct wire from the White Star Line in New York to the office of Colonel George D. Wick in this city brings the pleasing intelligence that Mr. Wick, his wife and daughter, and Miss Bennell are all aboard the Carpathia, set for New York." So initially we're reporting that he is safe. He is with the survivors. But it's interesting to note that there are, in the exact same issue, stories that said that he is not on the list. And there are also stories that say, well, that Molly is also not aboard. Now, we know that some of this was inaccurate information, but you kind of have to imagine the relief that would have come over people as they read this news that he was safe. And it would be another day or two that we would learn that he, in fact, was not safe. So we're going to head to April 17th. And this article reads, "Another day of the gravest anxiety is passed by relatives and friends of those who were on board." So there's speculation again. We start to hear of other families who thought that they had members of their family aboard, like John Malatic, I believe that's how he pronounces his name, though the copy of the Vindicator is a bit messy right where his name was at. He believed his niece Julia was on board, and he actually went to the Vindicator office every day waiting to hear of news if his niece Julia was on board. We lose her in history. I have no idea if she was aboard. She's not on any survivor or lost list that I could find, so she may have not been on board at all. Now, deeper in the same issue, we're going to find something really interesting. We find a dispatch by the Associated Press from Carolyn Bennell. And this dispatch basically states that all of the women were saved, but that Colonel Wick was missing. And I think that's interesting that is buried deep on page 15, while the front page is saying that they think he might still be okay. So the editor isn't really reading from the front page to page 15, because that's coming straight from the party in New York. But we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of how this information comes about. Now, on April 18th, the Vindicator had another extra, this time in the morning, that they reported the first authentic story of the Titanic disaster. And that same message that was in the previous issue is now there, saying that all of the women were saved, but that George was lost. And it also confirmed that Molly was saved because there were previous accounts that listed her as missing. And I think it's also interesting, there's a little article in this one too that's repeated a few times, that Colonel Wick never even boarded the Titanic, that he stayed in Paris to do business things, to take part in a Grand Prix sweepstakes pool. So I have no idea where that story originated, but it actually is repeated not only in the Vindicator but the Telegram a few times, that Wick actually never even got on board. We know that's not true, but newspapers, right? Gotta love the news. So we're going to keep going a little bit here. We're going to talk a little bit about what I think this would have been like for the folks here in Youngstown reading this news. So you have to remember these economic class differences. They're things we still face today, but they're incredibly divisive in 1912. And we know that Jenny could not read or speak English, or read or write English, and her spoken language was very broken. But just imagine what it would be like to be one of these other family members looking at the news of the Wick party, and nothing of your family is mentioned anywhere in these newspapers. And I think that had to have been quite heart-wrenching for these people, not knowing what is happening, especially because when they landed, they probably don't have the money to send telegraph messages or things like that, because in a lot of instances, Marconi is still charging people to send messages. He was a really nice guy. Brilliant guy, brilliant businessman, but sometimes, I mean, he's called in to do testimony as well. So let's talk about what Jenny is doing at this time. So she is dressed, like I said, only in her nightgown. She remains in her lifeboat for 6 hours, suffering greatly from exposure due to those extremely cold temperatures. She also notes that several people in her lifeboat died from exposure, just from being so cold that evening. Now, when they reached the Carpathia, she was hauled aboard actually by ropes and baskets, because most of them were so frozen that they couldn't even walk up the stairs. Upon her arrival in New York City, Jenny and Benora were cared for by a benevolent Jewish society known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And you can see them in this photograph. This is Jenny. And then this is Benora, as they're being cared for. And they assisted with many things that these passengers could not afford. For Jenny and Benora, they took them to a large department store and outfitted them with clothing and ensured that they were fed and had proper shelter. Jenny was also given $50 to purchase her train ticket to Youngstown. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Now, I talked about the miscommunication. This is in the Mahoning Dispatch, where it lists both Molly and Colonel Wick as both being lost on the ship, but we know that that is not true. So I want to talk a little bit more about that story of Miss Bennell, of Carolyn Bennell's thrilling story, right? Well, the thing is that it's not true. So Frank Hitchcock goes to New York. He is Molly's brother, and he will actually tell the Vindicator reporters that what you guys published wasn't true. So the story that you see here, the story of the wreck told by Miss Bennell, it's remarkable. It's beautifully well written. It is powerful. It's impactful. It has all these amazing statements, but it's not true. The Vindicator itself will published the article from Frank Hitchcock on April 22nd, saying that it was written a complete fabrication and written without her consent. Frank will also say that Caroline displayed great displeasure over the fact and trusts that her Youngstown friends and family will not have the opinion that she was commercializing her knowledge. So even though we have this story, there's a lot of evidence that it's not actually her words. We also know from Frank Hitchcock that Vindicator reporters sent to New York were actually faking that they were family members to get restricted access to the passengers. And that when the actual family members arrived, all the passes were taken, and they could not get back to meet with the Wicks because the Vindicator reporters took them all. Now, in this same issue here, we start to see some memorials to George Wick. We know that the church bells are going to toll throughout the city. Here's another cover, which I think has one of the better headlines, Scores of Lives Ruthlessly Wasted, a Sacrifice to Inefficiency. Now, I know we're running out of time, but I want to tell a few more stories before we get to the end here. There's a lot of newspaper articles about people that may or may not have been on board. We have stories of Bridget Menahan, whose aunt believed she was aboard. She was anxiously awaiting the news, only to find out she took a different ship home and she was okay. There's a reference to a Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Hoyt that a Mrs. Anna Hoyt thought was her son that she hadn't heard from in years. Turns out it wasn't. It was a Mr. and Mrs. Hoyt from Massachusetts. And all of these stories are in our newspapers. We also have this story of Philip Zanny. And he has a pretty remarkable story. He stopped in Niles for a while on his way to Dayton. And he tells a story of basically trying to get aboard a lifeboat and then being kicked off and then being almost shot. And then when the officer turned his back, he jumped onto the boat and hid under the seat and was able to be protected aboard the lifeboat. And he tells his story to the Niles Daily News on April 25th. So I just want to close this up with talking a little bit about the legacy of the people, kind of what they left behind, the things that had happened. So plans for memorials were underway almost immediately. The Wick party is staying at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, so very different than Jenny's accommodations when she reaches the shore in New York. Both parties, of course, on the Carpathia. So the April 19th issue of The Vindicator talks about a committee coming together to start planning a public memorial. Involved in that committee are James A. Campbell, or how do we pronounce his name? I'm not from her, Campbell, I always say it wrong. And Joseph G. Butler Jr. And they also decided to wait, though. What comes out of this initial committee meeting is let's talk to Molly and let's see what we want to do. Because they're also receiving news that Molly is still holding out hope that George is okay. So they don't want to start planning public memorials until she's kind of come around to the side that he did not make it. The Vindicator also reports that city memorials are being planned. Everybody's calling in to say what they should do. One of the first suggestions is that they follow the tradition of the railway, that when a major head of a railway company passes away, all of the trains stop. So they contact Youngstown Sheet and Tube to find out if they can stop production. And according to officers there, officials there, they note that with the exception of the blast furnace engine, the machinery and engines could be stopped with very little trouble. So that's one of the memorials they were going to try to put together. There's poems written to him. The mayor will proclaim that everything will stop on April 24th for 5 minutes as a token of respect to not only the dead of Titanic, but a silent tribute to the memory of our respected townsmen. There will be a memorial service at their church, the First Presbyterian Church, with brief statements from men who knew and loved him. So we'll talk just very briefly about the characters that we've met, the people we've met this night. So Molly really struggles with the death of her husband. Most of her family members confirm that she will stay in mourning the rest of her life, wearing dark-colored clothing until her own death in 1920. She was actively involved locally, with the National League for Women's Service, the local YWCA, involved with the Women's Workers Society of the First Presbyterian Church, and on the board of the Youngstown City Hospital. Her daughter, stepdaughter, Mary Natalie, was married in London in 1916 to a London-born colonel in the British Army, and their family stayed in Europe. Now, she flees Europe during World War II, but she will settle in Surrey, where she passes away in 1944. Now, Carolyn Bennell will come back to Youngstown and continue to live with her widowed mother. During the First World War, she was one of 3 Youngstown women to complete the first home nursing and first aid course offered in the city. Now, she's not able to go to service in Europe, but she continues locally to do that work. Now, she will work tirelessly for charitable organizations throughout her life, moving eventually to Shaker Heights outside of Cleveland, where she passes away. Now, we know that George Dennick Wick has a beautiful memorial at Oak Hill Cemetery. The tablet reading that it was erected in his honor, having gone down with the steamship Titanic when it sank. But I want to finish this with Jenny George's story. And I know we're running out of time, but bear with me. So, let's get back to Jenny George. So she will return back to Youngstown aboard the train to the Erie Terminal, just right down here, downtown. She's given $50 to make that return journey. So I will read to you just a few things that mention this here. So she had left Youngstown a year ago, this is in the Youngstown Telegram, to attend the bedside of her dying son in their native town. and she had left her children with the being cared for by Christ's mission, the father having died 5 years before. Now, as the eerie trade slowed down, the Syrian woman, almost frantic as a result of her awful experience at sea and the long, anxious days in New York, scarcely waited for it to stop when she spied her child, Rosie, on the station platform. Bursting through the crowd that would have restrained her, the mother rushed across Phelps Street with her arms flung upwards and with a shrill of a wailing cry flung herself upon her child. And the story goes on, it's beautiful, and it goes on to say that she will never forget the brave men and women who saved her life that night. So her story continues. One of the things that she writes about is that when she returned from Titanic, she had a full head of jet black hair. And within a few weeks, it started to turn gray, and within a year, it was completely white, completely white. So what do we learn from the Titanic? We learn a lot of things. We're almost done. We're almost there. So we learned that regulations are going to change. Traveling on a steamship never stays the same again. We could talk a lot about that. We learn a little bit about life, because that's what the Titanic is. The Titanic brings us a lot of things. It brings us every part of life wrapped in a really compelling story. It's grief, it's happiness, it's love, it's loss, it's anger and uncertainty, and it's sadness and it's fear, it's sacrifice, it's everything we feel as humans. But the Titanic also brings us one other thing. And I know this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but this is a heavy topic, so I want to end it with a happy note. Because the Titanic also literally brought us joy. Because Jenny George's story does not end as a laundress here in the city of Youngstown. Eventually, she'll bring her sons, Albert and Joseph, to the U.S., and the family will open a small grocery store in Brookfield. And in 1918, after buying an ice cream cone mold from another Lebanese man, they start an ice cream cone company at that Elk Road location. And Jenny worked there with her sons, then called the George and Thomas Cone Company. And today, that company is known as Joy Cone Company, and it's the largest ice cream cone company in the world. So, thank you folks for coming along. All right, I know we're a little bit past 1 o'clock. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. You're welcome to come up as well and ask me questions after. So thank you folks so much. Thank you. What? Sorry?
If you could please use the elevator and stairs here in the front of the ballroom. Thank you very much. If you're interested in seeing the exhibits on the first floor, please stop in the gift shop on your way downstairs.